Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really specific part of the book, Ultimate Full Stack Web Development with MEVN by Bhargav Bachina. We're focusing right in on Chapter 3, which is all about Vue.js kind of laying the groundwork. So our goal here, our mission, is to really pull apart those core Vue.js ideas. We want to get why it's such a big deal in web dev today and understand the essentials for actually building stuff with it, just like the chapter sets out to do.
That's right. And the chapter frames Vue.js as a progressive framework. That's a pretty important term here. It means you can adopt it bit by bit. You don't necessarily have to rewrite your whole project from scratch if you want to start using it. You can sort of ease it in. And yeah, the focus is definitely practical understanding the fundamentals, not just abstract theory.
Okay. So let's unpack this. The chapter covers a fair bit. Looking at the list here, it's like a roadmap. Why Vue.js, reactivity components, then the two APIs, options and composition. Then lifecycle hooks, styles, custom directives, slots, template refs, a drawer and forms. Whew, that is a packed chapter. Where should we even kick this off?
Well, I think we have to start where the chapter starts, right? With that big question. Why even choose Vue.js? And the backstory is pretty interesting. Created by Evan You, came out in 2014. And the idea explicitly was to sort of cherry pick the best parts from frameworks that were already big then, like Angular and React, and maybe make something a bit more streamlined or easier to pick up.
Okay. A synthesis, trying to improve on things. So what does the chapter say makes it stand out? It mentions things like being easy to learn, reactive, composable, good tooling, performance, community.
Exactly. And that ease of learning is a really big one. The syntax is generally seen as pretty clear, documentation solid. People tend to get up and running fairly quickly. Then there's that reactivity system, especially in Vue 3, using ES6 proxies. That's a core feature. It basically automates keeping your UI in sync with your data. Data changes, the screen updates automatically. That just simplifies things massively.
Right.
And building with components, these reusable chunks of UI, that's just fundamental to modern web dev, and Vue is built around that.
And the tools around it. The ecosystem. Chapter mentions Vue CLI, Vuex, Vue Router.
Yeah, those are key. Vue CLI gets your project set up fast. Vuex handles state management, keeping track of data across your whole app. Vue Router deals with navigation between different pages or views. Having these official, well-integrated tools definitely smooths out the development process.
Makes sense.
And performance comes up too. It's known for being relatively lightweight. It uses a virtual DOM.
The virtual DOM, like a blueprint.
Sort of, yeah. It's an in-memory representation of the actual UI. Vue uses it to figure out the absolute minimum changes needed in the real browser DOM when data updates. That's way more efficient than just rebuilding everything. Plus features like lazy loading for optimization, important stuff for bigger apps.
Okay, but it's not all sunshine and roses, right? The chapter gives a balanced perspective. Lists advantages, sure, easy learning, reactivity, components, performance, flexibility, ecosystem, community.
Right, but it also points out the other side of the coin. Potential drawbacks, like market share is growing, definitely, but it's still smaller than, say, React. There were some early issues with community resources maybe being less available in English because it took off quickly in places like China, though that's much less of a thing now.
Okay.
And the flexibility, it's a double-edged sword sometimes. If you don't have good team standards, that flexibility could lead to messy, inconsistent code.
Interesting point.
You might also find fewer super niche, complex examples or libraries compared to frameworks with a longer history. Maybe some bumps integrating into really large old systems without strict guidelines. SEO for single-page apps can be tricky too, though tools like Nuxt.js, which adds server-side rendering, are specifically designed to fix that.
Right, Nuxt.
And yeah, for the really advanced stuff, you're often relying on that ecosystem of libraries. So it's about weighing these pros and cons for your project, making an informed decision.
That context is definitely helpful. Okay, so moving from the why to the how, the chapter gets right into reactivity. We kind of touched on it, but what does reactive really mean when you're coding in Vue?
This is like the magic of Vue, core stuff. Basically, it means Vue sets up this link between your JavaScript data, the variables and objects holding your information, and the HTML template that shows it to the user. So when you change that data in your script, poof, Vue notices, and it automatically updates only the specific part of the web page that depends on that data. You don't manually touch the DOM for that.
Okay, so if I have like a counter variable message maybe, and I display it in my HTML. If I change the value of message in my JavaScript, the text on the screen just updates. by itself.
Exactly that. That's reactivity. It just works. The chapter mentions for the composition API, you use functions like ref for simple values, numbers, strings, and reactive for more complex things like objects or arrays. Wrapping your data in those tells Vue, hey, keep an eye on this. And under the hood in Vue 3, it's using those efficient ES6 proxies to track everything.
Got it. Sounds like a huge time saver. Less messing with manual updates. Okay, next up, components. The chapter calls them the building blocks.
And they absolutely are. Think of a website like Lego. Each component is a Lego brick. It's a self-contained little unit. It handles its own data, its state, how it looks, presentation, and what it does, behavior, like a button or a user profile card or even a whole page section. Usually you write them in .vue files, single file components. These bundle everything together neatly, the template for the HTML structure, the script for the JavaScript logic, and the style for the CSS.
Okay, so if they're self-contained, how do they talk to each other? Like, how does a button component tell the main page component, hey, I was clicked?
No.
The chapter mentions props and events.
That's the main way, yeah. The standard pattern. Props are for passing data downhill from a parent component to a child. It's a one-way street. The parent owns the data. The child just receives it as a prop.
Right, one way.
Events are for communicating uphill. The child component can send out a signal, basically. It emits an event, maybe named button clicked. The parent component can then listen for that specific event and run some code when it happens.
Props down, events up. Simple enough. But what about more complex situations? The chapter lists other patterns. Provide, inject, Vuex, event buses, teleport.
Yeah, for when simple props and events get awkward, provide inject is good for deep nesting. A component way up the tree can provide something, and any component deep down inside can inject it without passing it through all the levels in between.
Avoids prop drilling.
Exactly. Vuex is the go-to for managing state across your whole application, especially larger ones, a central store for your data. Libraries like Mint can create an event bus for components that aren't directly related to talk, though usually provide inject or Vuex are preferred for structure. And teleport. That's cool. It lets you render part of a component's template somewhere else in the DOM entirely. Super useful for things like modals or pop-ups that need to break out of their container.
Okay, got it. Lots of options for communication. So the chapter then kind of zooms into the script section of a component and compares the two main ways to write your logic. Options API versus composition API.
Right. This is a big topic in the Vue world. The Options API is the classic Vue 2 way, still totally fine and often simpler for basic components in Vue 3. You organize your code into, well, options. You have a data option, which is a function returning your reactive state, a methods option for your functions, a computed option for calculated values, watch for reacting to changes, mounted for lifecycle stuff. It's very structured by type.
Yeah, it feels like filling in specific boxes.
Yes.
Data here, methods there. The chapter notes, though, that if a component gets really big, the code for one specific feature might get spread out across all those different boxes, right?
That's the exact problem the Composition API aims to solve. It came in with Vue 3. It uses a central setup function. Inside setup, you use imported functions from Vue, like ref and reactive, to create state, computed to create derived values, watch or watch effect for reactions, unmounted for lifecycle hooks. The key difference is how you organize. You can group all the logic related to a single feature, its state, its methods, its computer properties together in one place, often inside reusable functions called composables.
Okay. So instead of account and data, increment and methods, double count and computed, all separate. With Composition API, you could have like a use counter function inside setup that defines the count ref, the increment function, and the computed double count all right there together.
Exactly. That's the core idea. It makes complex components easier to manage and makes extracting reusable logic way simpler. Plus, it generally works better with TypeScript if you're using that. But, and the chapter stresses this, Composition API is an addition, not a replacement. Options API is still great, especially for simpler components or teams comfortable with it. Vue gives you the choice.
Choice is good. Okay, speaking of stages and functions, the chapter brings up lifecycle hooks. What are those exactly? Sounds like points in time.
That's a good way to put it. They are specific points in a component's lifespan, its life journey. Vue gives you these hooks functions you can define that automatically run at key moments. right before it's created, after it's created, before it gets added to the page mounted, after it's mounted, before it updates, after it updates, before it's removed, unmounted, and after it's unmounted.
Okay. The chapter lists ones like on before mount, unmounted, on before update, on updated, on before unmount, on unmounted. What kind of stuff do you actually do in these hooks?
Well, unmounted is super common. That's the first moment your component is actually live in the browser DOM. So it's perfect for things that need the DOM, like maybe initializing a third-party charting library that needs a div to draw in, or making an initial API call to fetch data.
Right, when it's actually on the page.
Exactly. And then the unmount hooks, on before unmount and on unmounted, are critical for cleanup. If you manually set up event listeners or started timers, set interval, you need to clean those up here to avoid memory leaks when the component disappears. It's really important housekeeping.
Makes sense. Cleanup is crucial. And how do you use them? Is it different between options and composition API?
Yep. Slightly different syntax, as the chapter shows. In the options API, they're just methods you define directly in the options object, like mounted code here. In the composition API, you import functions from Vue, like import onMounted from Vue, and then you call them inside your setup function, passing your code as a callback. OnMounted, functional style versus object property style.
Gotcha. Okay, logic, lifecycle. What about making things look good? Applying styles, how does Vue handle CSS?
Vue's pretty flexible here too. You can do basic inline styles by binding a JavaScript object to the style attribute. More commonly, you'll use dynamic class bindings with .class. This lets you add or remove CSS classes based on your component's data, which is perfect for things like highlighting an active item, showing validation errors,
Yeah, toggling classes.
You can always use regularly global CSS files linked in your main HTML, of course. But one of the really popular, almost defining features is scoped styles.
Ah, scoped. That's where you put styles scoped in your .vue file. And the styles only affect that component. Magic.
Pretty much. It prevents styles from accidentally leaking out and messing up other components, or global styles messing up your component. It adds unique attributes to your HTML elements and rewrites your CSS selectors behind the scenes. It's a huge help for maintainability, especially in bigger projects with lots of components. The chapter shows exactly how adding scoped does the trick.
Brilliant. Okay, moving on. Custom directives. We know things like VF and vModel. But the chapter says we can make our own directives.
Yep. Custom directives let you hook directly into an element's lifecycle and manipulate the DOM when needed for reusable behaviors that don't quite fit the component model or reactivity system cleanly. You define them with hook functions again, mirroring the lifecycle. But for the element, the directive is on. Hooks like mounted when the element is inserted, updated when the element or binding changes. You can register them globally for your whole app or just locally within a specific component.
So, like the example in the chapter, making a v-focused directive that automatically puts the cursor in an input field when it appears.
Exactly that kind of thing. Perfect example. The directive's hook functions get access to the element itself, details about the binding, a binding, and the virtual node of node, giving you the power to interact directly when needed.
Cool. Okay, next up, slots. What are slots all about?
Slots are basically designated holes or placeholders inside a component's template. They allow the parent component that uses your component to inject its own content into those specific places. This makes components way more flexible and reusable. Imagine a generic card component. Using slots, the parent can decide exactly what goes in the card's header, body, or footer. The chapter covers default slots, like a main content area, name slots targeting specific placeholders like slot name header, and scoped slots.
Scoped slots. Those sound interesting. They let the child component pass data back to the parent, but only for the content inside the slot. Like the parent gets data from the child to help it decide what to put in the slot.
Exactly. They are super powerful for things like list components or data tables. The list component handles fetching and looping through data, but for each item, it uses a scoped slot to pass the item data back up to the parent. The parent then uses that data inside the slot template to define exactly how each individual item should look. Extremely flexible. The chapter also notes you can provide default content for slots if the parent doesn't provide anything.
Very neat pattern. Okay, nearly there. Template refs. Now, that word ref, again, but this is different from the ref for reactivity and composition API.
Good catch. Yes, completely different use despite the similar name. Can be confusing. Template refs are about getting a direct handle, a direct reference to a specific DOM element or an instance of a child component right from your JavaScript code. You do this by adding the ref attribute to an element in your template, like input ref, username input.
Okay, so I put ref my element on something in the template. How do I actually use that reference in my script?
So after the component is mounted and that element exists in the DOM, Vue makes the reference available. In the Options API, all your template refs are put onto an object called refs on the component instance, so you'd access it with this .refs.myElement. In the Composition API, it's a bit different. You first declare a reactive ref in your setup function, usually initialized to null, like const myElement equals ref null. Then you use that same name in the template, ref myElement. After mounting, Vue automatically assigns the DOM element, or component instance, to that ref variable. You access the element itself through myElement.value.
Ah, so Options uses this. Refs. Composition uses a dedicated ref variable.
Yes.
And you use this for things the reactivity system doesn't handle, like manually focusing an input or maybe integrating a non-Vue library that needs a DOM node.
Precisely. Direct DOM manipulation when absolutely necessary. Focusing inputs, triggering animations, measuring element sizes, integrating with third-party libraries that need direct DOM access. The chapter rightly cautions, though, don't overuse them for things Vue's reactivity can handle, and remember, they're only available after the component is mounted.
Got it. Last big topic in the chapter, understanding forms. How does Vue make dealing with forms easier?
The star player here is the vModel directive. It creates a seamless two-way binding between form input elements like input, texturious select, and a data property in your component state.
Two-way binding, meaning if the user types in the input, the data updates, and if I change the data in my script, the input field updates too.
Exactly. It synchronizes them automatically.
Yeah.
It cuts out a ton of boilerplate code you'd otherwise write to manually listen for input events and update state and vice versa. The chapter also shows the common pattern for handling form submission, using @submit.prevent on the form element. The prevent modifier stalks the browser's default form submission, which causes a page reload, letting you call your own JavaScript method instead to handle the data, maybe send it to an API, etc. It also briefly touches on doing client-side validation checking if the input is valid, often using computed properties or watchers to react to changes, and how vModel works nicely even with your own custom input components.
Wow. Okay, that was a serious walkthrough of Chapter 3. We went from the why of Vue.js through reactivity, components, the two big APIs, lifecycle, styling, custom directives, slots, template refs, and forms. Covered a lot.
We really did. It lays down a very solid foundation, hitting all those key concepts. You can see how the chapter builds up that picture of Vue as this blend of, simplicity, power, and flexibility.
Yeah, that flexibility really stands out, doesn't it? The choice between options and composition API, different ways to style, different ways for components to talk. It really shows how a framework can give you multiple paths to solve the same problem.
Which actually brings up an interesting point, doesn't it? With all that flexibility, how does a team decide which path is the best one for a given situation? When should you use composition API over options? When is a scoped slot better than just passing props? That flexibility is powerful, but it does mean you need to think carefully about the trade-offs, the complexity of the task, and maybe set some team standards.
That's a great question to leave folks with, something to chew on. So this chapter gets us set up on the client side, the front end with Vue. And the book, as the chapter wraps up, points towards the next step, shifting gears to the server side with Node.js.
Yep, moving from the browser world into the backend, starting to connect the dots for that full stack MEVN picture.
Absolutely, building the whole stack. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Vue.js fundamentals from ultimate full stack web development with MEVN. We'll catch you next time.